Hello and welcome to Level Up Podcast episode 2. Today with me, my good friend Felipe Te, composer, orchestrator, musician, Colombian, Canadian, and just generally, awesome human being. So welcome, Felipe.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Thank you. And first of all, I would like to jump away right in and ask you about what are you working right now on?
So right now I'm working on a Colombian feature called Estimados Señores, Dear Gentlemen. It's about the pathway to the women's rights movement in Colombia, for the suffrage movement, basically, during the 1960s throughout our dictatorship with Rojas Pinilla. And yeah,
you've been working in a lot of films recently, right? So how what's your split between composing, doing orchestral music, doing conducting, and doing music for film? What's your split?
And on top of that, you forgot teaching. I'm spread kind of thin these days, but I try to keep my calendar full as much as I can.
Yeah.
So now I'm working on this movie that I just mentioned. Last year I had a movie in TIFF, Aura. Nigerian-Canadian production, but I also help out a lot of the other composers in Toronto and abroad in LA. I usually serve as their orchestrator. Sometimes I'll be in as contractor, trying to find musicians to put a session together, basically a fixer of sorts.
Right.
And I will also be a conductor from time to time.
Right. So what's your split? Like you would say, at
50%,
yeah. I'm 50% composer, 25%.
Oh my gosh. I actually haven't even done the math. I want to say...
What do you do most?
I want to say I do composing the least at this moment.
Okay.
But I'm doing a lot of assisting work as orchestrator to other people. And I'm doing a lot of education as well. I teach orchestration, which is something that I'm very passionate about. Right. I'm passionate about teaching the younger generation of Toronto and across the world, the next generation of film composers. So I'm teaching at U of T, I'm teaching at TMU, I'm teaching at Sheridan, and I'm teaching at Centennial. And at the same time doing this movie. And what's my split on this? I actually don't even know what to tell you.
That's a lot of stuff. That feels like you're doing juggling a lot of things.
I want to say it's 20% film work, 20% helping others as an orchestrator / fixer, then 30% teaching. What am I up to now?
You're up there
I'm
in 70s.
Great at math. 70. Okay. So, but we need to leave a little bit for my time off. So let's say that I have 5% of time off, but then I'm doing other shit. I'm very bad. Don't ask me math questions,
Okay. So let's go back to the, composing for film. How was it the smooth transition from, composing orchestral music?
Oh, so that's the other split, the orchestral writing.
Yeah. Orchestral. You didn't mention that one.
That's another 25%. And then there's the 5%
we up to 156.
Yeah, we're up there. We're up there. So with orchestral, it's interesting because there is an overlap of work with purely orchestral music and film scores, but orchestral music is not necessarily film scores. It can be other things. And film score, especially today, doesn't really call for an orchestra all the time. There are other palettes. There's a more modern kind of sounds with either folkloric instruments from the region of the movie, which is what I'm doing right now with my feature. But then there's also synth work, which I'm very passionate about. I'm very passionate about sound design. So that's something that can cross into film composition, but doesn't find itself in orchestral composition.
Right.
If with regards to orchestral writing and film, we've been trying to put together an orchestra here in Toronto. We've had successful sessions. We call it the Canadian Studio Symphony. We've done sessions with other composers. We've done sessions just for my stuff. Right. And we want to open it up to the composer community. So that's the other 20% in the things that we're adding of just being a fixer and setting sessions up for others,
Right. What would you say? What would you rate complexity level of starting doing music and then composing, conducting, and then doing film music? What's the levels of complexity here? Which one is most complex? Which one is least complex for you?
I don't like to think in levels of complexity. It's really like just apples to bananas in terms of like comparison, especially because with like concert works, and I don't mean to sound pretentious. It's like it's art in the sense that it will take whatever amount of time it takes. You know, you usually have to just set a cap in terms of time. But with regards to film work, you're always under a deadline. And that deadline is always kind of breathing on your neck a little bit. And it's a bit of a contact sport in that regard, where like if orchestral writing or concert writing is writing at a slightly more leisurely pace, you know, you still have to complete your music, you have to complete your commission, and you have to complete the date in which it is premiering or recording or what have you, but you usually have more time. Whereas with film score, you have moving targets because the shoot, the edit of the film might change, and you need to readjust what you've done, or just a date has changed and there's a screening or whatever, and now you need to pick up the pace or what have you. It's more of a contact sport in that regard, and you are doing it for somebody else. And that's a big piece of the puzzle when it comes to film score composition is this piece of music is not for you, it's for somebody else, and you need to make the client happy. It's about the client. Whereas orchestral composition, or not orchestral, but like composition in general for the concert world, is a little bit more self-serving. That said, you still need to like think about your artistic directors, think about what the orchestras want, think about maybe what audiences want. So at the end of the day, in composition, you're still serving somebody else to some degree, but in film, you have a client, you know, whereas in concert, it's more self-serving. And I mean, I don't mean to say that in a bad way. It's more personal.
It's just the nature of business. Yeah, for sure. And I know you did a lot of interesting things, a lot of different things. You conducted, Abbey Road and in Budapest with the Budapest Symphonic Orchestra.
The Art Orchestra.
Art Orchestra. Sorry.
It's okay. Don't worry about it, man. Like
I'm close.
You were in the ballpark.
But how's the experience of like even working in Abbey Road Studio where the Beatles were recorded?
So at Abbey, it was great, and like it was. Like it's a magical place. It wasn't commercial when my project when I went there. It was the culminating experience of my master's thesis from being at Berkeley, and it was a fantastic opportunity to be there. And you learn a lot. You stand on the podium and you work with musicians they're just incredible. They'll read whatever you put in front of them. And that's the magic of these sessions that are designed for film versus concert world, is that concert world, there are rehearsals, there's a lot more time to cook the actual product. Whereas in film, everybody's sight reading. People generally show up to a session and they don't even know what is going on. They just show up and read. And that is a testament to their skill. And kind of the electricity that's in the room when you're doing something like that. It feels dangerous, you know?
Yeah, and it feels like almost like, what if you have 80 people like that who all like side reading right away on a spot, and like that feels, for me, it just feels like a logistical challenge, like impossibility. Like how you sure? I know that it's challenging to find 5 people who's talented, but finding 80 people who can read.
And these 80 people that are there in the session generally do this every day. They show up. Usually in these orchestras, you have the people that go to do their film recording in the day, and then in the nighttime they go to their orchestral gigs. But this is their shtick. They show up with their instrument and read, and then they go to their orchestral session, and then they perform the music that they've been rehearsing. And it really is quite magical. And in Budapest, my experiences have been more commercial. Like I've done orchestral arranging for other composers that have done their music at Budapest, but I've also gone to Budapest myself to conduct the orchestra with my own music and my own projects that have been just commercial stuff that I've been doing. And it's incredible to be there. I mean, the city itself is gorgeous, but the studio itself is fantastic. The musicians are, it's electric. It's
Right.
the only word that I can kind of find to approximate.
Right.
And we're also trying to replicate that sort of electricity, let's call it, here in Toronto with our Canadian Studio Symphony. We've spent time in finding the players for our ensemble, and these are people that I've done projects with, I don't know, like since I first arrived in Toronto in 2016. So I've gotten to know them very well, but I've also gotten to know very well the contractors that we work with and the conductor that I work with, who's a very talented young conductor, Lorenzo Guggenheim, who's done...
Shout out to Lorenzo. I worked with Lorenzo as well.
Shout out to Lorenzo. And we've been able to put a really good team here, and we want to replicate this magic, this electricity here in Toronto.
Well, I experienced it. I was on the recording sessions.
And so last year, what was this, November, I think?
I think so.
Yeah, so in November, we went to record at Rev in Revolution with this orchestra that we put together. And it was the first project that we were doing for another artist,
right?
Anastasia Minster. And it's
shout out to Anastasia.
Shout out to, there's going to be a lot of shout outs. So like it was very much a success, I feel, in that it was the first commercial endeavor that was not self-serving for me, because the first project that we had done was my music. Right. But I want this to be for everybody,
I remember that one. I remember your project, and I remember, working on this new project with other composers, and it was very interesting. And you create very accommodating atmosphere. Like you can set up, because I noticed that composers were on very different levels, different skill set, and different music, very different music,
and different sensibilities, different everything.
And you have a day or like less of a day of a session where pretty big orchestra. I don't know how big the orchestra was.
This was not as big. Okay, so which one are we talking about? The one that we did last year, or the last one that we did in November? The last one that
we did, yeah.
In November, that must have been maybe 34-ish people. Yeah.
It was still pretty big. And what I'm saying is, like, you have those musicians and they have to juggle between composers in one day. And composers will have very different pieces with very different style, tempo, and the sound. Like, they all had their own sound, right? Yeah. And it's like adapt to the sound of the different, like on the fly. Yeah. Like, that's pretty challenging. Yeah. You had great musicians. And you, as I said, you can set them up for the right, mood, and set them up. Like I enjoy how you work with the musicians, and you can set them up for the right,
There's a little bit of that happens when you don't just show up and then it's like go. You talk to them a little bit, hopefully, about mood. And when we write our sheet music, I always actually instruct my students to try to like set some sort of mood indication on paper in just plain language. Don't use like musical terms in Italian or something like that. Just try to say something that is the mood that you're trying to set. Don't use too many words. Just like, I don't know.
I feel it. I would describe it. I would say like some people can be like aggressive. Some people can be like light. Some people can be like chasing, fast.
Yeah.
Slow, like just a simple term. I had the teacher for in film school. I had teacher for musical composing, like composing for film, and he was very cool teacher. He didn't, because we were film directors, right? So we don't need the musical theory per se with the fancy Italian words and knowing the tempos and everything else. We just need the general feel, feel of it, and what works and what not. That was the main point. Yeah. And he kind of played us, for example, some, classical composers like Bach or Beethoven with the different conductors. Yep, and he will show us, and it changes completely differently. And he will play one conductor and it kind of stays in the same spot. Then he'll play like someone like Von Karajan, and it will like move forward, and then he plays some beginner composers or like not that great of a composers, and it will kind of stagnate and move backwards. And I was like, and you can really feel it in the music when music either stays on the same spot or move backward or move forwards.
Yeah.
And it's like it's kind of like you can describe it, but you can hear it. And I feel if people in majority, even audience, they maybe cannot explain what's happening. They're just not enjoying it. Yeah, it's very hard to put to words. But you can say, I that's the only way I got learned and I got taught to do it. It's just to understand it in a way of, is it stagnating or it's moving and developing? And this kind of, for me, those are kind of two terms that I kind of use to music, if it's good or not, especially for like orchestral music, complex music. And I feel it's a lot to juggle. It's more also like, it's not bad composers, as I said, it's just beginner composers who don't know the craft yet, for example.
Not even that, but when you mentioned this, like a new composition perhaps is being read against Beethoven 9 or whatever, a piece that has been played so many times and people know how it sounds. And this is a difficulty that newer composers have in the sphere of the concert world, is that there's just very little time to rehearse the music. So you could have music that is brilliant, but because it is not really rehearsed as much, it cannot shine as brightly. You know, so you kind of have to be, you have to balance as a composer, where it's like, man, like I want to do this, but maybe this is dangerous, or maybe I can be daring and try this or that. But the element of rehearsal time has, you know, been eroded a little bit, and it's just expensive, right?
Can you walk me, I actually have an interesting question about this. Can you walk me through the process of composer, like what actually, because a lot of people like me including wouldn't know, like what's a composer's job from the ground zero to like
so
finished
film
product,
or for what?
For I would say orchestral sort of, you know, classical music. Like what's the gig? What's the job?
The gig is you write the music. Hopefully you get a commission, right? Or you're making music for yourself, whichever. You decide, hopefully with somewhat ahead of time, what form or like what is it that you're going to do. In popular music, form has become kind of cookie cutter. It's like verse chorus, or intro, verse chorus. It follows a path that is very much been established. The advantage and difficulty in, call it art music, is that form isn't really established. You know, it can be anything that you want it to be. But for example, if you're writing a concerto piece, maybe you want to start fast and bold to hook people's attention, and your second movement is a little bit more slow, and then your last movement, and I'll talk about movements, and then your last movement is again fast, but like faster and bolder than the first one, because it's like the finale, right? By movements, I mean sections, you know, because you're looking at a greater piece that's like 20 minutes long and is broken up into different sections. They're called movements, right? So hopefully
your movements are equivalent to basically a song, or
you could call it a song. The whole like jargon in between like song or piece is just that song is sung. You sing a song, but in orchestral, like nobody's singing. I mean, yes, the performers are singing with their instrument, but there are no lyrics unless you're doing like an opera piece or something like that. I'm in this case, I'm referring to like instrumental music that has no singers, right? You'd call that a piece, but like, you know, for somebody, for the layperson, you could refer to these little movements or like intersections as songs that make up this bigger whole, right? So you start from this bigger whole and you're like, okay, well, that's what I want to do. And maybe like you start thinking about the mood that you want to evoke with the piece. And then you start going into even smaller subsections. It's like, okay, I'm looking at the opening of the first movement and I want it to be big and bold. What am I going to do? And then you start sketching melodies. And then, you know, people kind of do things differently.
So how do you actually start? Because it's like for you, you're already on this level that you're saying, okay, I'm going to do this first movement, second movement, and this is going to be, you know, big and this is going to be grand. But in my mind, it's like, okay, if it's a full orchestra, it's like 80 pieces. Wait, there's layers of music, like everyone is playing his own thing. So it's like, are you starting to work with like just general melody of like one instrument and then you layer them? Like, how do you do that?
So, okay, so when you say that there's like 80 people to an ensemble, sure, that can be the case. but you're not necessarily writing 80 lines of different music, right? Because like the first line of violin 1, like the first violin, second violins, viola, cello, bass, they all read from the same line. I know that there can be the pieces, I'm not going to get into that, but they essentially read the same line, right? Like the score that the conductor reads can be fairly big because all of the lines of each player is there on that page, and the players don't get the score, they just get their part, their specific part. But I would say that I don't necessarily start looking at the score. I actually start just sketching in the piano because I just need harmonies and melodies or textures. And I start sketching them out that way, but then you start assigning them to different families. Like, what do I want? Because a melody, the same melody on flute will evoke a different emotion than if it's on horn or trumpet or whatever. Like flute can, I know that this is stereotypical, but flute can sound airy and light and beautiful or whatever other adjective you want to add, whereas a horn can sound brave and just strong. It has a different connotation to it. That same melody on a bass clarinet will sound different, etc., etc. So you have to, you're thinking with colors now, where like the job of the orchestrator is almost to think in color, but like but color applied to sound, not applied to light.
In terms of like full orchestra, what are your first go-to instruments that you write first, and then the ones that you kind of close with?
I prefer starting with strings just because strings are like the backbone of the orchestra in from an orchestrational sense, and I don't want this to turn into a class. No.
I just for me, you actually educated, my audience and me, because we don't know that much about this, and I think even the people who may be like going into composing or musicians, they would be very interested in knowing this a little bit more in depth, like the step-by-step process.
Well, like so. Strings are the backbone of the orchestra, and you would call woodwinds color and brass power. Percussion also can be power and support, and they have different functions. Like you cannot have woodwinds and brass playing consistently, like throughout, because they're going to run out of breath. You usually save them for specific moments. Think of like tone colors for the woodwinds and thinking of power for brass, right? There's a reason why in like trailers you hear a lot of brass
it's like
and a lot of percussion because they're big and powerful, right? And but
you have to have those moments, and at least that's what I know from just generally art theory. You cannot have everything up there, like that. You have to.
Interestingly enough, that's what a lot of directors want.
No, but you can't. But you can't keep it, on the peak. People need to have.
You need
the peaks only work when you have those valleys that are really low.
That's right.
But you need to hear the difference. And so your dynamic. You need to have
loud,
your dynamic.
Nothing is loud.
Nothing is loud. No, because people will just tone it down and then nothing is loud. But that's where dramaturgy or like your storytelling comes in music. I would say it's even more important than sometimes in film, because I feel like there has to be, because quite often we all know term elevator music, right? It's like a one note, one thing, just going the same thing. It never changes, right? But you cannot use that music for film or anything, because nothing develops, nothing moves anywhere. And in most of the cases, when I, for example, looking for a score or looking for a music in a database or whatever, like I'm looking that music that has development, that has this moment that goes up. And
what's funny, as you mentioned, when you're looking in a database, I mean, sure, you're going to find that there's a lot of stuff that matches what you want, but it's never going to match exactly.
No, I will tell you how we work, on our side, like as editors or directors who edit their own stuff. How we work, we will stitch stuff together. We will like Frankenstein. Basically, what works for us. We will find, like quite often I will have a song and I'm like, it has to end, but it has to end on coda, on like certain, like, and has like a leftover reverb or something, right? So it's kind of, so quite often we will either chop the middle or we will start the song from like a big hit somewhere in the middle, and then we'll play it until this kind of portion of of musical portion that tells a story, like a chorus or whatever, ends, and then we will find the ending for it out of this song. We'll chop it, or quite often if they will give us like stems and like little portions of that, you can chop around quite often.
So
it's like Frankenstein. So it's basically and it's like, it's not out of luxury, it's more out of desperation, not having a composer who will compose it for you. So quite often in our case, it's like we dance from the different end of the flute, if you can say that, but basically we start with the song because we have to, because we cannot smoosh it or make it faster or make it slower, like that will distort sound too much. So we have to keep the the rhythm and tempo in it. So now it dictates
the pacing of the edit, and that's great.
Yes. Yeah. And then quite often the client will come back and they like, oh, I don't like the song, change the song, and you're like,
the edit is gonna...
It's like, you know what? You can just change the song. You might as well start it over. But that's not what the story about. The story about basically, so you lay it out and you, according to that musical piece that you have, you build the tempo and rhythm. And I feel when you're working with composer, and in those luxury moments when I had the chance to work with a composer, we work together on a short film that I recently finished and directed.
Shout out to you, shout out to me.
Yeah. It was a great experience because I had the freedom of editing and creating pacing that I want in the story with actors, and heading big pauses, and I knew that you will build the song accordingly around it, build the music accordingly around it.
And you did give me temp, and what you're describing is temp, like it's not meant to be beautiful, it's meant to be a Frankenstein.
No, but for me the thing
show us where to go.
That temp, it didn't dictate the edit. That temp actually dropped there after I did the edit, which is opposite usually what I do, because usually if I take the music, it will dictate the edit. It will dictate the pacing, because you'll be surprised, like the music you work with is just affects you so much. Like if you want editing, you put something that will dictate the rhythm and pacing and everything. So in this case, I edited it based on my feeling what the pauses need to be between actors, for them to think and like think next thing to say, process information that the other actor told them. So I kept that almost separate from, because I was like, I want to craft naturally speaking dialogue, something that's naturally paced and realistic. And then the beauty of it, I dropped the music, that sort of temp music that kind of evokes the mood that I need, and that was your reference. But to actually match then the music and those peak moments and the tension.
Well, you need something bespoke.
Yes, and that's that's where composer comes. But that's rarely happens. And to the getting back to all those videographers and using databases and using music and stems and stuff. What's your pet peeves in music? In music
in temp,
in not just in temp music, but I mean, what's your pet peeves in composing for films, and what do you kind of like hate when filmmakers do, and you think it's like unprofessional or like poor taste?
Well, I mean, okay, let me think for a second. So I mean, gone are the days of a locked cut. I think that just disappeared. I would love getting locked cuts that are actually locked, but but I think that's just it's not happening. So we have to adjust to a moving picture, and that's just it.
So your first pet peeve is basically unlocked unlocked edits that continuously have edits and so the images are not finished for you.
Yeah, it makes working difficult. Like small changes are fine, but like a whole scene insert or just a scene that was a completely different take from the one that you had, I mean, you kind of have to start over.
Exactly. That's the same situation when changing your music. You did your edit, everything aligns to that music. That's the, same kind of feeling you get from that. And then someone says, change your music. It's like, I might have, to start the whole edit from the beginning. And I feel if you, did your score, you did your music in a scene, right? And then they stretch something in the middle. They can say, oh, I just stretch the sound in the middle, but that's not how it works, right?
There are things that you can do that will make your life easy and it won't be terrible. But like if the cut is consistently changing. Like, I don't know, like an entirely new scene was added at the very beginning, then everything shifts downward in the timeline, and that makes it a little bit difficult. But, you know, we get used to it.
So that's a top kind of pet peeve. What's your other two, for example?
Actually, that's not my
top. Not the top?
No,
what's your top?
Not.
Tell me what's your top pet
Just
peeve.
references. Like, I know that temp is a touchy subject because of temp love. You know, like when you're talking about like, oh, well, as you mentioned, like the filmmaker will work on their particular project and they will have music that is synced as temporary and was used as part of the edit, etc. Well, they really like it as a result of just continually listening to it.
Exactly.
Just through exposure therapy, you become enamored by it. And anything that deviates away from it can be very difficult to digest for the filmmaker. And that is tough because we need to, like, you know, give the client what they want, but also we cannot copy to the point of copyright infringement, right?
Exactly, but you need also, you know, your artistic freedom, and if you're bringing a composer who has his own style, he will bring his style. That's why you're bringing him. And then when you're giving him temp music that's out of his style or like it, well, I don't think it's right.
If you're giving temp music that is not in the wheelhouse of the composer that you've chosen, then you've chosen the wrong composer, maybe. But also, on the flip side, not having a temp is also horrible because we need some sort of indication, or at least if there's no temp, you know, an indication of some sort of mood or style, or other film references are great. But when none of that is there, it's like, well, I have a blank canvas and like, I'm going to do something, but I'm not sure if that's going to be what it is. Like we need an indication of where to go musically. And oftentimes, if you're given just a blank slate, we'll give you something that we like and we think works, but that's not the game for film composition. The game is delivering to what the client wants. So we need some specifications, right? We need
I agree.
We need some rules for the game, right? In order for the game to work.
I agree. But it's interesting that you mentioned the just a mere exposure kind of complex. When people quite often work on something and work for so long that they kind of used to it, and there's a pitfalls to it, and pitfalls in pacing and dynamics of it. Because if you work on something very closely for a very long time,
you get tunnel vision.
But also you know you're so familiar with it, so you make it faster. You think your piece, like your editing, becomes tighter and tighter and tighter, and you make it.
I didn't know that
because you're familiar with the material, right?
Right. So you assume that everybody understands the material.
So you assume that everyone will be watching from your, you know, point of view, basically. And I'm not sure if it's happening, and that's my question. Is it sort of happening when you work on your music for a really long time and you already can hear every instrument separately, like really well, that you start smooshing them together, and then for the audience it's just like too much, too fast?
I would say no. The problem is different.
Okay.
The problem is there, but it's not what you're describing. Just from like working on the piece of music for so long, you can become very enamored by it, even if it doesn't work. Like it just does not work.
Right.
But you're enamored by it just through exposure, right?
Yeah.
And you have to learn how to kill your babies when you're working in art that is commissioned by somebody else to make them happy, right?
I actually have a good rule for this, because I have a rule of 30-70. That is like 30% of my time give me 70% of result, and to get that extra 30% of quality, I have to smoosh in 70% of extra time to achieve it. So I mostly get it up there, and I try to get rid of it as like and let it live. Because the thing is, I know a lot of people who will sit on a project for a really long time and polish it and everything. And trust me, you can polish things to infinity.
Can polish things, to infinity. But like at the end of the day, it needs to go. There needs to be a timeline. Actually, that's another pet peeve. Yeah. We need a timeline for deliverables, because if there's no timeline for deliverables, edits can go on for whatever amount of time that you want. And that's not great for anybody. Like things need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And like if we continue to polish and polish and polish and polish, you just need to let it like go into the world. Not in film work, but in mixing, like in music mixing, it's usually said that you're never done with a mix. let it go, right?
Right.
And that might actually be great, because to a certain point you can continue polishing, and then you start getting like negative returns where you're actually making damage to
exactly.
what you're doing.
That's what I was meaning, like, because you get so familiar with the material that you scan it so much faster. You're familiar with it, but you have to step back and think in terms of the audience who actually not familiar with the material, right? For them, it's completely new information.
Well, and that's also, and I'm talking about this in general for any sort of work that pertains to like making either music or art in general, is you have to have the ability to step outside of what you're doing and just imagine yourself as a person who is unfamiliar with what you're doing, unfamiliar with music, unfamiliar with the movie, and just try to put yourself in their shoes and see like, is this working? And not from like my theory of music or whatever it is that I'm working on, but no, like from an external perspective from somebody else, would this work? And if it's not, then just kill it,
Yeah.
Is this slow? Is this boring? Or is this whatever? And just, it's a great idea hypothetically or whatever, but, no, it's not working. Next,
Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned about this, just stepping out of your own kind of shoes and trying to get into shoes of your audience. Because I just remember one anecdote about my friend who's he's a film /TV composer in Ukraine, and he's a sound mixer as well. So he mixes a lot of sound. Like bulk of his work is sound mixing. And it's interesting because we worked on a couple of TV projects together, and he has this incredibly expensive home setup, home studio with like Adams and like fanciest monitors you can imagine, like preamps and everything. And we did this, I think it was a Hell's Kitchen. So he was mixing Hell's Kitchen, and he was mixing it on the dinkiest monitors, like the freaking like crappiest, like almost those plasticky PC ones. And I was like, why are you doing this? He's like, well, that's what people will be listening and on the shitty dinky monitors. So if I will mix it with this wide dynamics and everything in this Adam monitors in the studio, it wouldn't sound the same, in the in the TVs and so if you're making it for TVs, or you're making it for headphones, or you're making it for the phone, for the crappy speakers on the phone, you have to understand the dynamics and possibility of that, driver of that speaker.
We always try to deliver in the format that everybody will be listening in, right? Like you have to deliver in a way that it's going to work in a fancy schmancy big setup, but it will also be understandable in a not so much fancy setup. And doing mix checks is great. That's why mix engineers generally check their work in the car or something. Yeah. That's a very typical one. There's also like little cubes. They're like dinky cube speakers that you can just like check your mix in, because you sum everything to mono, and it's got no low end, it's got no high end, it's just mids. And if it's understandable there and it works there, then it's great, signed off.
Right.
But
it's interesting how that's the process of a lot of people who mixing and working with music. And then there's this niche and that's almost like a comedic relief. And I want to ask you a few questions about that.
Sure.
What do you think about like audiophiles and people who have golden cables and, about, $50,000 sound players?
I'm currently selling a $50,000 speaker set that has been blessed with holy water.
Okay.
So, they sound
That's
great.
A good deal. That's a good deal, people.
They sound great. They are holy. But no, so there is an argument to be made about like just being an audiophile and enjoying sound for what it is. Like, for example, and this is not necessarily the audiophile niche, but think about, for example, people who enjoy listening on vinyl. Because the format itself,
I get that. I'm talking about the
I understand.
I'm talking about what about the golden
cables,
the golden XLR? Does it make a difference?
No, of course not. But like what I mean is that's kind of like the edge case of like, okay, we're getting a little bit wacky with this.
Do you feel that it's like it's just the marketers and like store owners trying to sell it to like rich people who don't understand the sound and music?
Pretty much, but but again, that's a bit
the
of an,
funniest thing. I had an audiophile friend who were collecting, who were collecting very expensive setup of hi-fi, preamps and everything, and speakers that are like $50,000 each, like handcrafted, everything, gold cables and everything. And he was collecting.
They weren't blessed with
originals.
holy water though.
They weren't, but they
So mine are
were.
better.
He wanted to collect the originals of Beatles, and the funniest thing, that the originals of Beatles were mixed on much freaking cheaper.
Yeah.
And it was like most of the original mono.
Yeah.
Not even stereo.
Yeah.
It's kind of hilarious when you think about like all of this setup, and it's like there's no one mixed it.
That way. It
That
wasn't
way.
meant to be experienced that way either. So like where I'm getting at with this is that of course you have like an edge case like this that is comedic, where like, okay, this is perhaps maybe a little bit overkill, but there is like something to be said about the audiophile community in how they push forward new formats. For example, and this is like legitimate, like there was a time when, definitely not either of our times because we're too young for that, but we did not experience music in mono, for example.
Right.
We experienced music in stereo growing up. But like the leap from mono to stereo.
I think the leap was weird. I'm sorry for interrupting, but
No,
I
go
think
on.
the leap from mono to stereo was weird because I remember a lot of like oldies from like when, I don't know when first the stereo appeared,
Yeah.
but I'm thinking about like
You're thinking
50s,
about Beatles mixes where
like-
like drums are on one side.
I'm
and-
like, what the hell? Yeah, it's like the guitar is in one ear. So actually, the funniest thing, because I was listening, I think I was listening to Deep Purple or something, and one of my earphones broke. So I only had one ear.
So you lost half of the mix.
I lost vocals for
Yeah,
some reason,
yeah.
and I was like, because he was sitting in one ear, and
Yeah,
I was
yeah,
like,
yeah.
I was confused. That was
Well, you have to think, and again, this is something that I can speak of in terms of like how I was educated when it comes to sound because I didn't live through it.
Right.
But you have to realize that when mono was a thing, and then it's like no, now stereo is a thing.
Right.
There wasn't really the technical capacity that we have today to pan, where you're like in the panoramic spectrum of left and right. It was either left, center, or right. And it was an experimental at that time. Like imagine that, like being able to have stereo. It must have been groundbreaking at the time.
Right.
And some engineers like, well, let's fucking put the drums over here and see what's up. And let's try this and see what's up. It was a time to try things, and then technology changed and well, it evolved, but also
Do you feel like it actually de-evolved itself back to being basically mono because of the phones and everything? Because I'm thinking
I was
right
just gonna
now
say that.
you would rarely hear like a stereo sort of recording.
No, if you
like
have some sort of like a Bluetooth speaker set or whatever, you're experiencing mono.
Right.
At the end of the day, we have to deliver mixes that sum to mono and sound good in mono. But anyway, my whole shtick with this explanation of the leap from mono to stereo is that there was a further leap that we did experience growing up, because you and I are almost the same age, is the leap from stereo to surround. And surround, you at the time, definitely surround was more of the audiophiles game because it's expensive, it's difficult to set up. People mess up stereo. How are they going to like get surround right? And now we have yet another leap in technology that's surround to Atmos, which is what we have now in terms of deliverables for big cinematic experiences.
Explain to me in simple terms, like what difference between, surround 5.1, for example, and Atmos.
Atmos can contain, like it is a bigger, like the little like nesting dolls. So it's a nesting doll that contains a surround. Like there are different formats of surround, 5.1, 7.2, whatever.
Yeah.
But Atmos can contain them. It is a format that will play in whatever venue is equipped to play Atmos. You can play an Atmos mix that is 7.2 or 5.1 or whatever, because it envelops it. And it goes one step further to be immersive audio. It's no longer like, for example, when we're talking 5.1, the 0.1 means that you have a subwoofer.
Yeah.
And the 5 means that you have left,
speakers,
right, center, back left, back right. Those are the 5 speakers.
So in terms of Atmos, what's the arrangement?
You just have more. You can have more.
How much more?
I honestly cannot tell you because I'm not an expert in Atmos, but the format can go like really big in terms of the numbers of speakers that are around you, you know.
Yeah.
I've recently gone to a studio in Toronto that is equipped for Atmos. Justin Gray's studio. Shout out to Justin Gray, super great engineer and musician and also educator. He's also a jack of all trades. And his studio setup for Atmos has the subwoofers. It has, like if I'm imagining correctly, it has the left, the right, the center. Then it has 2 wides. Then it has 2 backs. But it also has 2 front elevated ones and 2 rear elevated ones, if I'm not mistaken. Justin, if you're hearing this, I'm so sorry for messing up what your setup is. But
so what would you say the utility of it besides film? Because I get it in film, you kind of want to have people driving, people shooting in different years and stuff like that. What's the utility of it for music?
Well, the end game here is being able to deliver Atmos in a format that is able to be put together by the layperson, right? Because if not, then we have the same drawback of surround, where it's like, oh, I have a bunch of speakers and I have a bunch of cables, I can't put this together, stereo, and just throw it away. But now you can find sound bars that will work via Bluetooth and connect themselves to different speaker setups, or be able to bounce sound from different corners of your room.
But you still haven't answered my question. What's the utility for music? What kind of music suits, even 5.1?
So here's where it becomes a big utility, is that Atmos can be down mixed into what's binaural. Binaural as in stereo experienced through headphones specifically.
Right.
How do people experience music these days? Mostly through headphones.
Right.
So you can have a mix that roughly translates an immersive experience in headphones. So imagine like having surround light, but in headphones.
Right.
That's the whole like shtick that it's trying to sell. But so there's the cinematic experience, and then there's the musical experience. A lot of classical records have been remixed for Atmos. There's a lot of records from the Beatles and what have you that have been.
I'm still having a hard time to understand how application of like music, even classical music, within that Atmos. Like, how would I hear brass in the back and
you technically
strings
could.
in the front?
So
like,
in the score that I'm remixing now with Justin, we literally were having that conversation. I think this was like starting of December, end of November last year, where we were mixing a particular cue in this film. And I was like, you know what? Wouldn't it be cool if we had the horns in the back for this cue? Because it gives us a sensation of space.
Right.
And we put the horns in the back, and effectively when you sit down to experience it, it just feels like you're enveloped, immersive, right?
Right.
And the big deal here is that with the same file that I deliver to you, you can down mix that without having to like do any sort of change in your setup to experience that in headphones.
Right. So
the translation is not exact.
Right.
Because you still won't be able to feel like there's a back portion of the mix.
Right. But you will hear
But it will collapse the mix and it will work in binaural. Right. Instead of having 2 different files or 3 different files or 4 different files for different
Atmos
setups.
just allows you to have basically one file for different setups.
It is a container format. Exactly.
Right. Oh, that's very cool.
Again, I may have spoken out of my ass. I'm not sure. No, I'm kidding. Like I'm not an expert in Atmos, but I know enough of it in order to I released one of my records in Atmos. I wasn't the Atmos mixing engineer, but it was a whole conversation, and I had to check my mixes. And yes, the surround or immersive elements are blah, blah, blah. And it has its own kind of workflow to it, which is still changing, by the way. It's bleeding edge technology, which means that every month some sort of new development comes around in order to work with it, which makes it difficult to work with, but it's at the very same time exciting. And that's genuinely an area of for sure, audiophile. You want to experience an immersive experience for your music. Right. Isn't that amazing? The whole gold-plated cables, not so much. I'll keep my holy water speakers.
Maybe someone will buy it for me.
Yeah. I'll put it on Kijiji and see what's up.
But I had another interesting question about you traveled a lot, right? You've been places. You've been Europe, US, studied at Berkeley, and Colombia, obviously, and so you experienced different, music places musically, right? And how would you compare Toronto to all those other places?
Well, I mean, Toronto is eclectic in the sense that it's a mix of very different places. I'm not sure, and I don't say this meaning to say this the wrong way, but I haven't experienced a Toronto sound in terms of like older music that has grown with the country or what have you. There is a Toronto sound when it comes to like modern hip hop or that kind of stuff. It's different eclectic genres.
Right.
And there is a thing to be said about Toronto where it's a place where different cultures mix, and I really like that. I did music that was Serbian, for example, with a Serbian singer here in Toronto, and that same singer happened to like Spanish music, so I wrote boleros as well.
Interesting.
And it was like, again, done from like a Canadian Torontonian perspective. At the same time, my film music, it like draws from everywhere basically, and the projects that are done here are very much like world projects. The last project that I did, Aura, which is what Nigerian Canadian, so it had an eclectic mix of Nigerian sounds, but also more modern filmy sounds. I don't want to say Toronto sounds because even though I've nationalized myself as Canadian and I've lived in Toronto for a long time. It's 7 years. I mean, 7 years is a long time, and at the same time, it's not.
It feels like nothing because I feel like we moved at about the same
we did.
time. And we met
2016.
Yeah, I think so. The first time, the first time I came,
it was like a cafe,
and then I returned, and we met at the cafe, and that was I think you just came as well.
Yeah. This was at around, where was it? Like in Etobicoke part of town.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, I have no idea where the hell I am. I just want to meet people. It was a time in my life where genuinely, when I came to the city, I set up an objective to myself where it was like, if I am not meeting somebody new every day, I'm wasting my time.
Yeah, because it's interesting. It's very similar to how I kind of approached it, and it was very like ground zero. Everything is new because I left my country, and I had a lot of my friends were like, "Oh, why are you like going there? No one knows you. You already build yourself here. People already know you here, and then you're nobody there." And I was like, that's the beauty of it. No one knows me. I can, no one knows what I did. Like I can start over. I can start. It's a fresh start. You can build yourself.
Yeah, it's
you don't have to repeat the mistakes of the youth and like being wild.
It's very exciting. It's new. It's fresh. It's also hard as fuck.
Yeah.
But like in looking back, I'm very happy with that decision, and I've done things that I know if I had stayed home, I maybe more than likely would not have done. Right. And
I feel that I don't know about Colombia, but for example, I'm Ukrainian, and in Ukraine is very samey kind of people, samey kind of music.
What's a homogenous society?
Yeah, it's homogenous. It's the same kind of type of a person you see everywhere. Same type of a girl. Same type. We don't have like any kind of people, Irish or like
well, that's what I meant when
Chinese. We don't have that. I don't meet that in Kiev, and like you wouldn't see them except as like exchange student. You will see like there will be like one.
You wouldn't even see exchange students like that in Colombia, and that's what I mean when we were talking about Toronto. It's like it's an eclectic place because there's people from everywhere, and I dig that because I don't know it's not like, ooh, so special me, ooh, the eclectic one. No, but it's like I like that there is a lot of different people to learn from in terms of
I feel like for creative people, it's an opportunity to collaborate with the different people and learn and pick, different things from different cultures and like how other people do it. And then for musician, I feel like it's a big opportunity to work with the different instruments, with different musicians, different sounding stuff, like you were mentioning, right? Like,
so just going back to the whole composition shtick for a little bit.
Yeah.
I feel to a degree that composition is like experimentation. You know, you're kind of paid to experiment when you're talking about, well, what's this whole composition shtick? What do you do? And a lot of it is experimentation, and you get to experiment at home behind closed doors to see what cool stuff you can do that maybe hasn't been done yet. I mean, it's difficult to reinvent the wheel these days. Everything is to a degree out there. But finding out different ways of doing things and doing them musically is something that I like when I'm exploring new compositions that I'm making. And definitely being exposed to this environment of newness where like there's just so much to pick from. It's almost an overload of the senses. And I say this in a good way, where there's so much around to be inspired by. Not saying that there's not anything to be inspired by in Colombia. There's a lot, or in Ukraine for that matter. But it is definitely a specific, singular kind that is homogenous.
Yeah.
And there's not that variety. That said, like the movie that I'm making right now, Estimados Señores, has a Colombian sound mixed with modern film aesthetic.
Right.
And that's something that I could only have done having lived in Colombia and experienced those sounds. But and a lot of the music that I make for concert as well draws from Colombian tradition. But I never see myself as a composer that basically draws on Colombian tradition only. I draw from creative outlets that are not Colombian as much as I can as well, because it's, I don't know, there's beauty in difference, I want to say. And that's a very artsy way to just, you know, say like, yeah, I like different shit.
Right. I'm also thinking about a different question. Well, for example, if you were a composer, starting composer, or a aspiring composer, what sort of, the initial bricks that you need to have, like in terms of like,
Your building blocks ish?
Yeah, you're basically building blocks, but in terms of like, music, do you need to have, perfect music hearing or whatever?
Well,
perfect pitch or whatever?
No, I don't have perfect pitch. I wish I did. And I'm sure that people who have perfect pitch wish that they didn't.
Really?
That's something that gets said a lot. But like, for film composition, you essentially need certain tools. That's a given. You need to be working from a DAW, a DAW, what is it called in the editor land? LNE, non-linear NLE. What is it?
Non-linear editing.
Yeah, the NLE. Yeah. To us, it's the DAW, the digital audio workstation.
Okay.
Same shtick, different medium. Yeah. It's the non-linear editor for video,
sound.
And in my case, for sound.
Yeah.
You need.
I started on linear. My first job was in television.
You did
I started on beta cams.
Holy smokes.
And then DVC Pro. And the first editing suite that I ever went to was just the tapes. Like, so you put the Betacam, tape in your master. And it's an empty tape. And then you have boxes with the beta tapes that has the camera angles and material, and that's what you edit to. And you have to edit it into that tape, your master tape, right?
Live.
Yeah. Well, it was kind of sophisticated because it had it will remember the time codes. It can recreate stuff. Because now imagine, so you edited 1 hour long show, right? And now imagine if you want to insert something. How do you insert? Yeah. Right? You cannot move stuff. Stuff wouldn't shift. You can only re-record on top, right? Yeah. But how would you remember all of the edits that you did, right? So machine help you a little bit. The editing station help you a little bit that it remembered the time codes and it can recreate it if you want to shift something. So that was helpful. But when I was starting, I didn't even know it could do that. So quite often I would do something that is like 30-minute, TV show that I had to reassemble because I messed it up in the beginning. By memory, basically.
Holy
it's
smokes.
like it was. I imagine with a.
Well, that must have been great training.
It was a great training. It was a great experience. It was just allowed you not do it in the first try and be super meticulous. And I think in any job you talk about like attention to detail. Everyone says attention to detail. Attention to detail is a big thing, and
especially in what we do.
Of course,
and especially if you're an editor.
Exactly. Well, and I feel nonlinear. What we have now is just like million times easier.
Yeah.
You less stressed. You can jump into any portion of your mix, of your editing, and like change that portion. Before that was, you have to re-record, and then re-record, like imagine it has to be precise, frame to frame precise. And in terms of, if you probably re-recording sound piece on top of, your tape, your audio tape, you have to be even more precise because there's no frames, I imagine.
Well, I mean, I can't speak to working in a linear way because I've always experienced DAWs digitally and non-linearly. I've always had that luxury. But I was just going to say, like, as listening to you, having done work in a linear format only, I think that not only is it a great training, but it develops an instinct for commitment, like being able to commit to an idea, because you have to.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But like now we have the luxury of not having to commit, but commitment and making choices is also important. And that's something that, like, I try to do that when I'm working on my scores. I try to commit stuff. I always like leave space to come back for editing, but I commit it in such a way that it's like, okay, it's done, move forward.
So Felipe, what's your recommendations for aspiring film composers?
It is a marathon, so you have to be ready to keep up. Like it's work that is done through a long period of time, and it's not just like one blip of a lot of energy burnt at once, and it's a long career path. Definitely try to keep updated technologically to what's out there. Every year, every month at this point, there is some sort of new thing out there. And it's also a great time to be in media, in the sense that there are so many tools available to us, both in like from the film editor / cinematographer / director perspective, and from the music making perspective, where the tools that we have access to now 30 years ago would have been, just too expensive for anybody to get into. Even just, it would be too difficult. So it's definitely prime time in terms of capacity to get into it, but it is a marathon, and you have to like keep at it for a long time. And
what do you see the challenges with the students that you work with? What do you see that the challenges that they are facing right now?
Well, I mean, there's the big obvious one on everybody's mind, I think, which is AI. Mm-hmm. AI is spooky for many reasons. I suspect that like our jobs are still safe in music. I'm not going to get into the whole details of it because it's just that would be another podcast. We can start another one.
That's a good story for another day.
But I think you can just call it my own gut instinct that like we're still safe for the time being when it comes to AI. But there are difficulties today when it comes to like IP rights, intellectual property rights that composers face with regards to getting royalties, or with regards to getting into cue sheets, or just payments in general can be difficult. It's a career that takes time to build. So again, going back to the analogy of the marathon, it takes a while, and you have to be consistent. And in today's students, me being in different institutions, I see that, and this happens everywhere, not only in the places where I teach, but also the places in where I've learned. People come in with such varied backgrounds, and that's both great and difficult in the sense of teaching a syllabus that is condensed and specific, etc. But all of that doesn't mean that it's impossible to teach a diverse set of students. That's not the case at all. But it takes effort, and it takes continued effort to make it work. And I think that applies to the arts and media in general, right. I would say. And having it's difficult to say, to have the guts to stick to your guns when you're protecting your identity as a composer or as an artist in general, but also being flexible enough to be steered in the direction that the client wants. It's a bit of a balancing act.
Exactly.
Where you have to be flexible enough to acquiesce to what your client wants, but also at the same time keep your own voice as a composer. I think that's the exercise when you want to still keep your voice, but still do what you're instructed to do in a particular case where you're asked to come close to the temp, for example. But being able to commit to your ideas, you know. And in nonlinear editing, it is easier to not commit to your ideas because you always have Command Z to, you know, or Control Z to undo whatever mess up that you did. But being able to commit and render the stuff that you're working on takes guts, but it also takes processing power away from your computer. So if you're starting out and your rig's not powerful, committing is good, actually.
Well, let's segue into, you know, what's next for you. What are you working on? You know, what's in the pipeline? So
right now I'm working on doing music copying for an artist in Vancouver. We're going to do a recording session with some players that are being sourced from VSO, from the Vancouver Symphony. And that is going to be performed at the Warehouse. That's the studio that Brian Adams owns in Vancouver.
Nice.
I have a full semester of teaching starting at Metropolitan University. That's a new one. And working on some of my concert music. I have a violin concerto that I have written that hopefully we'll be able to record this year.
Nice.
I need to get going on a cello concerto that I need to write, that I already have funding, that have been funded for, and I need to get it out the door. Again, like deadlines.
Right.
And that's my personal deadline. Like that is something that I need to work on my own, because it is my project that has been funded, and I am both the composer and also the manager of the project. So it's difficult when you're the manager of your own project, because you can go on forever if you wanted to, but no. End dates are important and calendar is important.
Exactly.
Otherwise it goes on forever.
Exactly.
So cello concerto, violin concerto, I have some piano stuff I need to write. I have those arrangements I need to do for VSO. There's a documentary that's coming in March, and just stuff that hopefully comes down the pipes.
And where people can find, you know, where people can find your music?
You can search for it on Spotify, just my name, Felipe Te. You can also look me up online, just like my website is my name, Felipe Téllez, Tellez. I mean, Google is pretty forgiving these days. If you just type my name, stuff is going to pop up.
Okay, that's good.
Which means that my web developer has done a good job at their SEO package. So good for him.
Good web developer, if you can find it.
Shout out to Isaias. Many shout outs today.
Well, thank you, Felipe, for coming. It was a true pleasure. And we actually have unfinished topic about the AI. I feel like it will be a good cliffhanger for next episode. But thank you for sticking out with us, and thank you for listening. And I will see you in the next one. Have a good one.
Congratulations.